There are years that remain etched in the collective memory of a country like invisible scars, marks that divide time into a before and an after. For Spain, 1992 was one of those watershed years, a moment of national euphoria that promised definitive entry into European modernity, the culmination of a democratic transition that had taken nearly 2 decades to consolidate. The Barcelona Olympic Games and the Seville World Exposition projected to the world the image of a renewed cosmopolitan nation capable of organizing events of planetary scale with an efficiency that surprised everyone. The streets of the great cities buzzed with optimism. Newspapers spoke of economic miracles, and for the first time in generations, Spaniards felt that their country occupied its rightful place among the developed nations of the world. But it was the year when Kobe, the Olympic mascot, smiled from every television screen, every shop window, every child's T-shirt. And it was the year when the Olympic torch traveled across the peninsula, igniting hopes, when gold medals accumulated, and the national anthem resounded again and again on the podiums of Montjuic. The transformation was palpable in every aspect of Spanish life. New highways connected cities that had seemed isolated for centuries. High-speed trains promised to shrink distances between Madrid and Seville. Modern airports welcomed visitors from around the world, who came to witness Spain's coming-out party on the global stage. The peseta was stable, foreign investment flowed in unprecedented quantities, and unemployment, though still high, seemed finally to be decreasing. Young professionals who had studied abroad returned home convinced that Spain finally offered the opportunities they sought, that they no longer needed to emigrate to find success. The cultural scene flourished with a creativity that matched the economic boom. Spanish cinema won international awards. Spanish music topped European charts. Spanish fashion designers dressed celebrities in Paris and New York. It felt like the country was finally shaking off the dust of decades of dictatorship and isolation, finally joining the concert of modern European nations as an equal partner. The streets of Barcelona sparkled in the light of the closing ceremony fireworks. Spaniards celebrated their athletes' victories as national triumphs, and even the most skeptical had to admit that something had changed, that the country had crossed an invisible threshold toward a promising future. The economy seemed to be booming. Europe looked at Spain with admiration, and the sense of inferiority that had marked generations of citizens was finally giving way to a new national pride. The media of that time spoke of a new country, of a modern and dynamic Spain that had definitively buried the vestiges of the Franco dictatorship. Young Spaniards, born in democracy and raised in the relative prosperity of the 80s, felt like citizens of the world, connected to international culture, free from the complexes that had weighed on their parents and grandparents. It was the year when Spain, at last, seemed to have left behind the ghosts of its past. But beyond the great cities, beyond the spotlights and cameras that broadcast sporting exploits to millions of homes, there existed another Spain. A Spain of small towns, where life flowed according to ancestral rhythms, where traditions weighed more than fashions, where neighbors knew each other by their names and surnames, by their family histories, by the church pews they occupied every Sunday. It was the Spain of Valencian orchards, of orange trees that perfumed the air in spring, of rural roads lined by centuries-old irrigation channels, of card games in the bars on the square, of patron saint festivals that gathered entire generations under the same August sky. It was a Spain that looked with some bewilderment at the media spectacle of that glorious year, aware that modernity arrived drop by drop in its cobblestone streets, in its cultivated fields, and in its lives built on simple certainties. Alcàsser was one of those towns. Located barely 15 kilometers south of Valencia, in the Huerta Sur region, it then had just over 8,000 inhabitants who lived mainly from agriculture and small local industries. Its streets traced a network of low houses, many of them inherited from previous generations, with interior patios where lemon trees and jasmine grew. The church of San Martin dominated the town center, and around it spread the spaces of community life, the town hall, the square where the weekly market was held, the bars where men commented on the day's news, while women bought freshly baked bread from the traditional bakery. Children played in the streets until nightfall. Teenagers gathered on street corners to share furtive cigarettes and dreams of the future. The elderly observed the passage of time from their wicker chairs, placed on the sidewalks, when the heat pressed down. It was a place where everyone knew who was who, where secrets lasted little, and news traveled from mouth to mouth at a speed no newspaper could match. It was a safe place, or at least that's what its inhabitants believed. Alcàsser's security was not that of electronic alarms or armored doors. It was the security of mutual knowledge, of the certainty that any stranger would be immediately identified, of the trust that neighbors watched over each other. House doors remained open during the day. Keys were hidden under flower pots by the entrance. Children walked alone to school as soon as they were old enough to cross the street. Crime was something that happened elsewhere, in big cities, in marginal neighborhoods, in American movies that played on television on Friday nights. In Alcàsser, the most serious thing that usually happened was quarrels between neighbors about property boundaries, some bar fight after a night of too much wine, the occasional theft of oranges by outsiders who didn't understand that it was a minor crime, but still a crime. Evil, true evil, belonged to another world, to another reality that had nothing to do with these streets where grandmothers recited the rosary at dusk, and Sundays smelled of paella simmered over a slow fire. November 1992 had arrived with its usual cortege of gray days and intermittent rains. The Valencian autumn doesn't have the harshness of the north of the peninsula, but neither does it retain the benevolence of the Mediterranean summer. The nights were growing longer. Plane tree leaves carpeted the sidewalks, and the air carried that particular smell of wet earth that announces the approaching winter. The Olympic euphoria had been left behind, already archived in collective memory as a luminous recollection that contrasted with daily routine. Newspaper headlines now spoke of economic crises, political tensions, the first symptoms of what would end up being a harsh recession. But in Alcàsser, as in so many towns in Spain, life followed its immutable course, indifferent to the big headlines, concentrated on the small joys and small worries that weave the existence of ordinary people. Miriam Garcia Iborra had just turned 14. She was a teenager with an easy smile and a curious gaze, an 8th grade student at the town school, with that mix of shyness and irreverence that characterizes those who are discovering they are no longer children, but don't yet know exactly what they are. She liked music, like all girls her age, and devotedly followed the hits that played on the radio, the romantic ballads that spoke of impossible loves, the danceable rhythms that animated the discotheques she wasn't yet old enough to enter, but which she imagined as temples of future freedom. She lived with her parents in a house in the town center, a hard-working family that had placed in her all their hopes, all their dreams of a future better than the present they had known. Miriam was a good student, responsible within what can be expected of a teenager, affectionate with her family, though she sometimes showed that budding rebelliousness that is part of growing up. Her parents, Fernando and Rosa, adored her with that mixture of pride and worry that all parents of teenage daughters feel, aware that the world could be dangerous, but confident that their little girl would know how to take care of herself. Antonia Gomez Rodriguez, whom everyone called Toñi, was 15 years old. She had been Miriam's friend since childhood, a playmate first and confidant later. One of those friendships that are forged in schoolyards and seem destined to last a lifetime. Toñi was more extroverted than Miriam, more prone to easy laughter and witty comments, with a personality that lit up every room she entered. She also lived in Alcàsser, in another house in the center, daughter of a family that, like many in the town, earned their living through effort and dignity. She was cheerful, vital, with that inexhaustible energy of adolescence that seems capable of conquering the world. She liked to dance, go out with her friends, talk for hours about everything and nothing, make plans for a future that seemed infinite. Her parents, Fernando and Rosa, shared their names with Miriam's parents, one of those coincidences that in small towns become anecdotes repeated for generations. Desiree Hernandez Folch was the third of the group, also 14 years old, a resident of Alcàsser and inseparable friend of the other two. Desiree was perhaps the most dreamy of the three, the one who lost her gaze in imaginary horizons, the one who wrote poems in secret notebooks, the one who believed in true love and the happy endings of romantic movies. She lived with her family in town, a daughter of working parents who had built their home brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. She was a sensitive, intelligent girl with that apparent fragility that hides unsuspected strengths. With Miriam and Toñi, she formed an inseparable trio, one of those groups of teenage friends who share secrets, laughter, tears, and dreams, who call each other on the phone every night to discuss what happened during the day, even though they saw each other just a few hours before, who plan their future as if the world belonged to them. Friday, November 13th, 1992. Dawned like any other autumn day in Alcàsser. The three friends attended class normally, discussed plans for the weekend, exchanged confidences during recess. It was another working day, and one of those days that leave no trace in memory, because nothing special seems to distinguish it from the previous ones. But that Friday had something that made it different. That night, there was a party at the Cooler discotheque in Picassant, a neighboring town located a few kilometers away. The Cooler discotheque was one of those venues that attracted teenagers from across the region, a space where they could dance, meet friends from other towns, feel for a few hours part of a world larger than the streets they knew by heart. For girls of 14 and 15, going to the discotheque was an adventure, an affirmation of independence, another step toward the adult life that awaited them. Miriam, Toñi, and Desiree had made plans for that night. They would go together to the discotheque, they would dance, they would have fun, they would return home with stories to tell and memories to cherish. It was the kind of plan that millions of teenagers make every weekend around the world, an innocent activity that is part of the process of growing up, of exploring the limits of freedom, of building one's own identity beyond the family framework. Their parents, though perhaps with some reservations typical of their generation, had agreed to let them go. They trusted their daughters, knew the families of the friends, knew they would go together and would look after each other. Besides, the discotheque wasn't far, And in that Spain of 1992, in that Valencian region where everyone knew everyone, what could happen? Friday afternoon passed with the anxious slowness of party eves. The three friends prepared in their respective homes, carefully choosing their clothes, styling their hair in front of the mirror, perhaps applying a bit of furtive makeup that their parents preferred not to see. They arranged to meet at an agreed time to head together toward Picassant. The problem was transportation. None of them was old enough to drive, their parents couldn't take them, and public transport in that rural area was scarce and unreliable, especially at night hours. The solution they chose was the same one many young people of the era chose: hitchhiking, asking some driver to take them to their destination, trusting in the kindness of strangers, in that solidarity between neighbors that characterized rural Spain. Hitchhiking was then a common practice, especially among young people from rural areas who had no other means of transport. It wasn't perceived as something dangerous, but as a practical way to get around, a demonstration of the trust that existed among members of a community. Drivers would usually stop to pick up walkers, especially if they were young people from the town or the surrounding area, known or at least recognizable people. It was a tacit pact of mutual help that worked most of the time without incident. Nobody thought that getting into a stranger's car could have fatal consequences. Nobody imagined that the road separating Alcàsser from Picassant could be the scene of a tragedy. That Friday evening, Miriam, Tony, and Désirée left their homes with the joy proper to those going to meet fun. It was around 8:30 in the evening when they said goodbye to their families, promising to return at a reasonable hour, to behave well, to look after each other. Their parents watched them leave with that mixture of love and worry that always accompanies those who let their children go, trusting that the world will be kind to them, that they will return safe and sound, that the night will bring them only good memories. None of them could imagine that this would be the last time they would see their daughters alive. The three friends walked together through the streets of Alcàsser, probably laughing as they commented on their expectations for the evening, the boys they hoped to see at the discotheque, the music they would dance to, the gossip they would exchange. They reached the road connecting the town to Picassant and began signaling to passing cars, looking for someone to take them to their destination. Night had already fallen, and the road, though not particularly lonely, it wasn't as busy as during the day. It was cold, the typical damp cold of the Valencian autumn that slips between clothes and settles in the bones. The girls waited, gesturing to passing vehicles, until finally one stopped. What happened from that moment on remains shrouded in shadow, reconstructed only partially through subsequent investigations, the testimonies of the culprits, the forensic evidence that was found weeks later. What is known for certain is that Miriam, Tony, and Désirée got into a vehicle that took them away from the safety of their town, from the streets they knew, from the lives they had planned to live. What is known is that on that Friday, November 13th, 1992, 3 innocent teenagers crossed paths with the most absolute evil, with a cruelty that defies all human understanding. And what is known is that they never arrived at the Couleur discotheque. They never danced that night. They never came home. The first hours of absence did not generate immediate alarm. It was Friday night. The girls had gone to a party. It was normal for them to return late. Their parents waited with the contained impatience of those who know their children are growing up, that they need their space, that they cannot control every minute of their lives. But when midnight passed and the girls didn't appear, when calls to the other families' houses revealed that none of the three had arrived. Worry began to transform into anguish. Perhaps they were running late. Perhaps they had met someone. Perhaps they were somewhere without the possibility to call. Rational explanations were exhausted one after another, and in their place grew a dark, unnameable fear that the parents tried to push from their minds, but which refused to disappear. When Saturday dawned, and the three teenagers still gave no sign of life, the alarm spread throughout Alcàsser. Miriam, Tony, and Desiree's parents gathered, exchanged information, tried to reconstruct the last known moments of their daughters. They went to the Guardia Civil to report the disappearance, but in those days, the protocols for missing persons cases were different, and authorities tended to wait a prudent time before activating all search mechanisms. It was thought that the teenagers might have run away voluntarily, that perhaps they were with some secret boyfriend, that they would appear at any moment ashamed, but safe and sound. It was an era when the disappearance of minors did not generate the immediate response we know today, when society had not yet learned the lessons that cases like this would teach it in the cruelest way. The neighbors of Alcàsser mobilized spontaneously. In small towns, one person's misfortune is everyone's misfortune, and the disappearance of 3 girls from the town was an event that shook the foundations of the community. Search parties were organized, groups of volunteers who combed the surrounding fields, who traveled the roads, who asked questions in neighboring towns, who searched for any clue that might indicate where the teenagers were. The bars became information centers where rumors and hopes were exchanged, where men planned search routes while women prepared coffee and sandwiches for the volunteers. The church filled with faithful who prayed for the return of the girls, candles burning before the image of the Virgin, promises whispered in the dimness of the naves. The mobilization quickly exceeded the limits of Alcàsser. Volunteers arrived from neighboring towns, from Valencia, from the entire region. Parents' associations, sports clubs, parish groups, everyone wanted to contribute to the search. The region's roads were traveled dozens of times, fields searched meter by meter, wells and ravines inspected with flashlights and ropes. Guardia Civil helicopters flew over the area, searching from the air for what eyes on the ground could not find. Tracking dogs were brought in, sniffing the missing girls' clothes to try to catch their scent. But the days passed, and the search yielded no results. It was as if the earth had swallowed the 3 teenagers, as if they had evaporated into the cold air of that Valencian November. The tension in the town was palpable. Conversations stopped when someone passed by. Glances became laden with suspicion. Rumors ran from house to house. Was there a monster among them? Was the culprit someone they knew, someone they had greeted 1,000 times on the street, someone who had shared their celebrations and mourning? The idea was unbearable, but it had settled into the collective unconscious and refused to leave. Parents kept their children at home. Teenage girls no longer went out alone. Doors that had remained open for generations now closed with double locks. Fear had replaced trust, and the town that had been a refuge had become a prison. The simple act of walking down a familiar street at dusk suddenly felt dangerous, laden with menace that hadn't existed before. The community that had prided itself on its safety now looked at itself with new eyes, wondering what darkness might lurk beneath the surface of everyday life. Days passed, and the girls didn't appear. The family's anguish transformed into desperation, that terrible feeling of powerlessness before the unknown that devours the soul of those who wait for news that doesn't come. Miriam, Tony, and Desiree's parents lived in an endless nightmare, trapped in a limbo of uncertainty where every minute was an eternity, where every phone ring accelerated the heart, where every car stopping at the door could bring the hoped-for news or the dreaded one. They didn't sleep, barely ate, couldn't think of anything other than where their daughters were. Where were they? What had happened to them? Were they alive? The questions repeated without answer, torturing those who asked them with the cruelty of uncertainty. The local press began to echo the disappearance, and little by little, the news climbed toward the national media. Spain discovered that 3 teenagers from a Valencian town had disappeared without a trace, and the case began to capture public attention. It was a story that touched sensitive chords. 3 young girls, innocent, who had gone out one Friday night to have fun and hadn't returned. They could be anyone's daughters, any teenager's friends, any town's neighbors. The identification with the victims and their families was immediate, and interest in knowing what had happened grew exponentially. Television, which in that Spain of 1992 was experiencing a profound transformation with the arrival of private channels, found in the case of the Alcàsser girls, a topic that attracted massive audiences. News programs opened with the latest news from the search. Current affairs shows dedicated long minutes to analyzing possible hypotheses. Reporters traveled to the town to interview neighbors, relatives, authorities. It was the beginning of what would end up being an unprecedented media coverage in Spain, an obsessive attention that would transform the case into a social phenomenon of unexpected dimensions. Families clung to hope like a drowning person, to a lifeline in the middle of a storm. As long as there was no certainty otherwise, their daughters could be alive somewhere, waiting to be found, waiting to return home. Miriam, Tony, and Desiree's parents appeared on television launching desperate appeals, asking anyone with information to contact the authorities, promising there would be no reprisals, that they only wanted to get their girls back. Their emaciated faces, their voices broken by emotion, their eyes reddened by tears and insomnia, became images branded into the memory of millions of Spaniards. The pain of those families was the pain of an entire country that helplessly witnessed a tragedy unfolding in real time. Christmas 1992 arrived without the girls appearing. It was a dark Christmas for Alcàsser, a Christmas of anticipated mourning, of Christmas carols that rang hollow, of celebrations no one felt like celebrating. The families of the disappeared spent those holidays in a state of emotional suspension, unable to rejoice, but also unable to surrender to despair. In the homes of Miriam, Tony, and Desiree, the girls' rooms remained untouched, their beds made waiting for a return that each day seemed more improbable, their personal objects converted into relics of interrupted lives. It was January 27th, 1993, when the nightmare reached its darkest point. That day, 2 beekeepers traveling through the place known as La Romana, in the municipality of Tus, about 60 kilometers from Alcàsser, discovered something that froze their blood. In an area of low scrubland, away from roads and difficult to access, they found the bodies of 3 young girls. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, but everything indicated that they were Miriam, Tony, and Desiree. After 75 days of searching, of hope and despair, of prayers and tears, the girls of Alcàsser had been found, but not in the way their families had dreamed during those interminable weeks of uncertainty. The place where the bodies were found was rough terrain, covered with bushes and thorns, difficult to access even for someone who knew the area. It was a place deliberately chosen to hide the victims, a place where the bodies could have remained undiscovered for years, if chance had not led those 2 beekeepers to them. The scene was macabre. The three teenagers lay a few meters from each other, their bodies partially covered by the vegetation that had grown during those weeks. Wild animals had done their work, and identification would have to be confirmed by forensic analysis. The beekeepers, still in shock from their discovery, immediately alerted the authorities. Within hours, La Romana filled with Guardia Civil vehicles, ambulances, forensic vans. A security perimeter was established, and experts began methodically working to document every detail of the crime scene. The news of the discovery spread like lightning across the entire country. Television stations interrupted their programming to report the discovery. Newspapers prepared special editions. Radio stations dedicated hours and hours to analyzing what had happened. All of Spain stopped before the confirmation of what many had feared, but no one had wanted to accept. The three teenagers were dead. The pain that had accumulated during weeks exploded in a wave of collective mourning that did not distinguish between those who knew the victims personally and those who had only followed the case through the media. The tragedy of Alcàsser had become the tragedy of an entire country. In Alcàsser, the impact was devastating. The town that had kept hope alive for more than 2 months sank into an abyss of pain and rage. The church bells tolled in mourning, flags were lowered to half-mast, shops closed their doors as a sign of grief. Neighbors gathered in the streets, embracing, crying, unable to find words to express what they felt. The families of Miriam, Tony, and Desiree lived the most terrible moment of their lives, the confirmation that their daughters would never return, that the dreams they had woven for them had shattered forever, that the future they had imagined would never exist. The funerals of the three teenagers gathered thousands of people in Alcàsser, a silent and grieving crowd that accompanied the families in their darkest hour. The town's streets filled with flowers, candles, messages of condolence that arrived from every corner of the country. The coffins of the three teenagers were carried on the shoulders of their neighbors, while the church bells never stopped ringing, and collective weeping rose toward a gray sky that seemed to participate in the general mourning. The media covered the funerals with an intensity bordering on obsession, television cameras capturing every tear, every gesture of pain, every moment of the ceremony, to broadcast live to millions of homes. What the autopsies would reveal in the following days added layers of horror to a tragedy already unbearable in itself. The three teenagers had been victims of extreme violence, of a cruelty that defied human comprehension. They had been kidnapped, tortured and murdered, with a brutality that the forensic pathologists themselves described as unprecedented in their professional careers. The details of what they had suffered before dying were so atrocious that the authorities decided not to make them public in their entirety, fearing the impact they could have on society and, above all, on the victims' families. But enough information leaked for Spain to understand that these three girls had lived through hell before their lives were torn away. The family's pain was immeasurable, a pain that no word can describe, that no consolation can alleviate, that no time can erase. Miriam's parents, Tony's parents, Desiree's parents faced not only the loss of their daughters, but also the knowledge of what they had suffered, the unbearable image of their agony, the certainty that they had died alone, terrified, in the hands of monsters without humanity. How to continue living after something like that? How to get up every morning knowing what one knows? How to find meaning in a world where such atrocities are possible? These were the questions that tortured those who had lost their dearest beings, questions without answers that would accompany them for the rest of their lives. The police investigation intensified after the discovery of the bodies. They were no longer searching for 3 missing persons, but for those responsible for 3 murders. The Guardia Civil deployed all its resources to solve the case, aware that the entire country was waiting for answers, that media pressure was enormous, that they could not afford to fail. Forensic evidence found near the bodies was analyzed. Potential witnesses were interrogated. The movements of potential suspects were traced. The area where the victims had appeared was examined minutely in search of any clue that could lead to the perpetrators. Forensic experts worked day and night analyzing every fragment of evidence, every DNA particle, every fingerprint. Investigators questioned dozens of people, reconstructed the girls' movements that night, checked the alibis of all potential suspects. The investigation soon pointed to 2 men, Antonio Angles Martins and Miguel Ricard Tárrega. Both were known to the security forces. Both had criminal records. Both lived in the area where the girls had disappeared. Antonio Angles, 27 years old, was an individual with a criminal record that included robberies, assaults, and other crimes, and that he had grown up in a problematic environment with a dysfunctional family marked by marginality. His father had been absent. His mother had struggled to raise her numerous children in conditions of extreme poverty. And Antonio had early learned that survival required taking what one could without worrying about the means. He was known in his Catarroja neighborhood as someone best kept away from, someone capable of violent outbursts, someone who seemed to have no moral limits. His neighbors described him as a man with a cold gaze, unpredictable manners, who inspired instinctive fear even when he wasn't doing anything threatening. There was something in him that made people uncomfortable, a darkness that showed through despite his efforts to appear normal. Miguel Ricard, 29 years old, was his usual companion, an individual of lesser intelligence but equally dangerous, who followed Anglais with canine loyalty and participated in his criminal activities without questioning them. Ricard had also had a difficult childhood, marked by abandonment and neglect. He had been placed in institutions from a young age, passing from one foster home to another without ever finding the stability he needed. His school career had been disastrous, and he had quickly abandoned any attempt at formal education to dedicate himself to petty crime. His relationship with Anglais was that of a follower with his leader, a weak man who found in the other's strength a meaning for his own existence. Together they formed a dangerous duo, each feeding the worst instincts of the other, pushing each other toward acts they might not have committed alone. And the trail that led to these 2 men was a car, a white Opel Corsa that had been seen the night of the girl's disappearance. Witnesses remembered having seen a vehicle matching that description in the area where Miriam, Tony, and Desiree were hitchhiking. The car belonged to Antonio Angles's family, and investigations revealed that both he and Ricard had used it that night. Forensic evidence found in the vehicle and at the place where the bodies appeared linked both men to the crime. Everything indicated that they were responsible for the death of the 3 teenagers. Miguel Ricard was arrested on January 28, 1993, barely a day after the discovery of the bodies. Initially, he denied any involvement in the events, but faced with the accumulation of evidence, he ended up confessing his participation, although he attributed most of the responsibility to Antonio Angles. According to his version, Angles had been the mastermind and main executor of the crimes, while he had limited himself to following his orders, unable to oppose his companion's will. His statement was chilling in its coldness, in the absence of remorse, in the way he described acts of extreme cruelty, as if they were routine events. The investigators who interrogated him were marked by that experience, by direct contact with an evil that seemed to have no bottom. But while Ricard was being arrested and beginning to collaborate with justice, Antonio Anglès had disappeared. From the moment the bodies were discovered, Anglès understood that the police would come for him, and he decided to flee before they could capture him. He abandoned his home in Catarroja and vanished without a trace, beginning a flight that would become one of the longest and most fruitless in Spanish criminal history. From that moment on, Antonio Anglès became one of the most wanted fugitives in Europe, the object of an international manhunt that would mobilize multiple police forces for decades without achieving his capture. Anglès's flight added a new dimension to the tragedy. Not only did the families have to face the mourning for their daughters, but they also had to bear the injustice that one of those responsible remained free, escaping the punishment he deserved. Every day that passed without Anglès being captured was another day of suffering for those who had lost Miriam, Tony, and Desiree, a constant reminder that justice had not been done, that evil remained unpunished somewhere in the world. How had he managed to escape? That was the question everyone asked. Investigators reconstructed his initial route. After leaving Catarroja, Anglès had headed south, crossing Spain toward Portugal. He had traveled using improvised means, avoiding main roads, hiding during the day and moving at night. He knew the techniques for evading police, and he applied them with surprising discipline for someone who had until then been a small-time criminal. Some suspected he had received help, that someone had provided him with money, contacts, perhaps even a new identity. But these suspicions could never be confirmed. It was known that Anglès had reached Portugal, probably crossing the border through forest paths where controls were non-existent. In Lisbon, and he would have lost himself in the popular neighborhoods, living from odd jobs and begging, waiting for the opportunity to definitively leave Europe. The port of Lisbon, with its incessant traffic of merchant ships, offered infinite possibilities for someone who wanted to disappear. Sailors and dockers were used to seeing stowaways, and for a few bills they could pretend not to see anything. That's how, according to the most widespread theory, Anglès would have boarded a cargo ship heading for the unknown. One of the most persistent theories about Anglès's fate held that he died during his flight. According to this hypothesis, Anglès would have secretly boarded the city of Plymouth, a cargo ship under Irish flag that set sail from Lisbon in March 1993, bound for Dublin. During the crossing, a stowaway was discovered aboard, a man hiding in the ship's hold. Confronted by the crew, the stowaway reportedly threw himself into the sea, disappearing into the Atlantic waters without being rescued. His body was never recovered, and his identity could never be confirmed. But many believe that man was Antonio Anglès, and that he had preferred death to capture. However, this theory was never proven, and officially, Anglès remains a fugitive wanted by Spanish justice. The judicial trial against Miguel Ricard took place in a climate of extreme tension. He was the only defendant present, since Antonio Anglès remained in unknown whereabouts, and on him fell all the anger of a society demanding justice. Ricard was tried by the Provincial Court of Valencia in a trial that attracted unprecedented media attention. Every day of the trial made the front pages, and every statement was analyzed down to the smallest detail. Every gesture of the accused was interpreted by experts and commentators. The courtroom was packed every day, with lines of people waiting hours for a seat in the public gallery. From the victims' families to simple, curious onlookers, from journalists to law students, everyone wanted to witness this historic trial. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a tension that threatened to explode at any moment. Security officers had to be constantly vigilant, as threats against the defendant were numerous and some very credible. During the trial, more details were learned about what the three teenagers had suffered at the hands of their captors. The forensic reports, the expert statements, Ricard's own testimony, painted a picture of horror that was difficult to assimilate. And the girls had been taken to an isolated place where they had been subjected to unimaginable abuse for hours before being murdered. They had suffered in ways that no human being should ever suffer, at the hands of individuals who had renounced all humanity to give themselves over to the darkest and most depraved instincts. Hearing those details was torture for everyone present in the courtroom, but especially for the victims' relatives, who had to face the reality of what their daughters had lived through before dying. The defense lawyers had the impossible task of defending the indefensible. Their strategy consisted mainly of trying to reduce Ricard's responsibility, presenting him as a follower manipulated by Anglais, a man of weak will who had been dragged into something beyond him. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and his own testimony, in which he described the crimes with icy detachment, only made his situation worse. The prosecutors, for their part, demanded the maximum penalty, arguing that Ricard had been an active and willing participant in every atrocity committed against the three teenagers. Ricard was sentenced to 170 years in prison for 3 crimes of murder, 3 of rape, 3 of kidnapping, and 1 of illegal weapons possession. The sentence was received with mixed feelings. On one hand, it was celebrated that at least one of the guilty would spend the rest of his life in prison. On the other, it was regretted that Spanish legislation of the time prevented applying more severe penalties, and that the effective execution of the sentence was limited to a maximum of 30 years due to the prison benefits then in force. For many, that sentence was insufficient for a crime of such magnitude, one more injustice added to all the previous ones. For the families, no possible sentence could compensate for what they had lost, could give them back their daughters, could erase the horror of what had happened. The Alcàsser case also had repercussions in the legal and political sphere. Public outrage at the perceived inadequacy of the sentences, at the prison benefits that would allow Ricard to leave prison after serving only part of his sentence, generated a debate about the need to reform the penal code. The convenience of establishing reviewable permanent prison sentences for the most serious crimes was discussed, as was the limitation of prison benefits in cases of special cruelty, the protection of victims and their families against the possible reintegration of offenders. Although legislative changes would take years to materialize, the Alcàsser case was one of the catalysts that drove the public debate on criminal justice in Spain. Citizens' movements demanding harsher penalties for crimes against minors gained momentum, and politicians from various parties incorporated these demands into their electoral programs. While Ricard began serving his sentence in prison, the search for Antonio Anglès continued without success. Over the years, there were numerous alleged sightings of someone who was supposedly Anglès in different parts of the world. He was believed to have been seen in Ireland, Brazil, Argentina, Australia. Each sighting generated a wave of hope that he would finally be captured, followed by the inevitable disappointment when it was verified that it was a false alarm or a different person. Anglais had become a ghost, an almost mythical figure who seemed capable of outwitting all the world's police forces, of living forever hidden while his victims rested in the Alcàsser cemetery and their families continued to wait for justice. His escape became one of the most frustrating enigmas in the history of Spanish criminology, a symbol of the system's impotence against certain forms of evil. Antonio Angles remains, 30 years after the events, one of the most wanted fugitives in the world. His face has been virtually aged in police computers, which have created images of what he might currently look like to facilitate his identification. He is included on the most wanted lists of Europol and Interpol, and periodically investigations are reactivated when some lead emerges that might lead to his location. But to date, all efforts have been fruitless. Angles has proven to be a master of evasion, capable of completely disappearing from the radar of half the world's security forces. The case of the Alcàsser girls had a profound and lasting impact on Spanish society. An impact that transcended the purely criminal aspects to affect the way Spaniards understood security, childhood, the media, justice. It was a case that shattered the innocence of a country that believed itself safe from certain horrors, that thought tragedies like this only happened in other latitudes, in more violent societies, in more problematic contexts, and the discovery that the most absolute evil could lurk on any Spanish road, in any apparently quiet town, transformed collective perception in a way that remains palpable today. From Alcàsser onward, the relationship of Spaniards with their children changed. Hitchhiking, which until then had been a common and generally safe practice, was stigmatized forever. Parents became more protective, more vigilant, more wary of letting their children move freely. Warnings multiplied about the dangers of talking to strangers, of accepting favors from unknown people, of trusting those one doesn't know. An entire generation of children grew up hearing that the world was a dangerous place, that there were monsters who looked like normal people, that prudence was more important than trust. The Alcàsser case became the definitive example of what could happen when one let one's guard down, the horror story told to justify restrictions and controls. This transformation of collective mentality had lasting consequences for Spanish society. Public spaces, which had been places of meeting and socialization, became suspicious territories where danger could arise at any moment. Parks where children played freely emptied or filled with anxious parents who supervised every movement of their little ones. Teenagers who had been used to going out in groups and returning late discovered that their freedoms were suddenly restricted, that their parents wanted to know exactly where they were at every moment, that they had to call to confirm they were okay. Some psychologists and sociologists criticized this reaction, arguing that it was disproportionate to actual risks. Statistics showed that kidnappings and murders of minors by strangers were extremely rare, that the vast majority of crimes against children were committed by people in their close circle. But statistics could do nothing against the visceral fear that Alcàsser had awakened, against the images of 3 smiling teenagers who had become icons of lost innocence. Reason yielded to emotion, and emotion said that the world was dangerous and that one had to protect one's own at all costs. The media impact of the case also set precedents that would mark the future of Spanish journalism. Alcàsser was the first major criminal case experienced live through television, the first example of what would later be called mass crime journalism. Television stations discovered that violent crimes generated enormous audiences, that the morbid sold, that pain could become spectacle. The programs that covered the case broke audience records, and the networks took note. From then on, crime would become regular content in the television schedule. Studios would fill with criminology experts and victims' relatives, and true crime would establish itself as a genre of mass consumption in Spain. But this media transformation did not come without controversy. Many criticized the way the media had treated the Alcàsser case, the excessive exposure of the family's pain, the dissemination of macabre details that contributed nothing to understanding the facts, but fed the public's voyeurism. The ethical limits of journalism were debated, as was the right to information versus respect for victims, the responsibility of the media in shaping public opinion. Some television programs were accused of having turned the tragedy into a circus, of having exploited others' suffering to gain audience, of having contributed to creating a climate of hysteria that benefited no one. Particularly controversial was the treatment that certain media gave to the conspiracy theories that began to emerge around the case. As months passed and Antonio Anglés remained uncaptured, theories began to circulate that questioned the official version of events. Some maintained that Anglés and Ricard had not acted alone, that there were other people involved who had never been investigated. There was talk of pedophilia networks, of powerful figures who had covered up their participation, and of a large-scale conspiracy that made the Alcàsser crime the tip of the iceberg of something much larger. These theories, fueled by frustration at Anglés's escape and perceived inconsistencies in the investigation, found echo in sectors of the population who distrusted official institutions. One television program in particular became the epicenter of these controversies. Under its host's direction, the show dedicated multiple broadcasts to the Alcàsser case, giving voice to those who defended alternative theories, interviewing supposed witnesses who provided contradictory information, openly questioning the actions of the justice system and the Guardia Civil. The program reached millions of viewers, but it also generated fierce criticism from those who considered it was spreading unverified information and creating confusion instead of clarity, and adding suffering to the victims' families by keeping alive a wound that never finished closing. The debate about the role of that program in the Alcàsser case would continue for decades, becoming an example of the dangers of sensationalist journalism and the spread of unfounded theories. The proliferation of these conspiracy theories had devastating effects on several fronts. First, it diverted attention from established facts and concrete evidence that existed against the accused. Second, it generated widespread distrust of institutions, feeding a social cynicism that has not stopped growing since then. Finally, and perhaps most cruelly, it indefinitely prolonged the family's ordeal, who could never turn the page because there was always someone to suggest that the truth had not been discovered, that the real culprits remained free, that their daughters deserved a deeper investigation. The families of Miriam, Tony, and Desiree lived through all this with a mixture of pain, rage, and helplessness. Not only had they lost their daughters in the most terrible circumstances imaginable, but they also had to bear watching their tragedy become entertainment material, the most intimate details of their suffering exposed before millions of viewers, their mourning constantly interrupted by journalists, curious onlookers, and opportunists of all kinds. Fernando Garcia, Miriam's father, became a public figure in the years following the crime. Unable to accept that Antonio Anglés might escape justice, he devoted his life to keeping alive the memory of the case, to pressuring authorities not to abandon the search, to appearing in the media remembering his daughter and demanding justice. His face, prematurely aged by pain, became a symbol of the suffering of all families affected by violent crimes, the embodiment of a father who cannot rest while his daughter's killer remains free. Fernando Garcia died in 2023 without having seen his wish fulfilled that Antonio Angles be captured and tried. He departed with the uncertainty of not knowing whether the main person responsible for his daughter's death was alive or dead, free or hidden in some corner of the world. Miguel Ricard served 20 years in prison and was released in 2013 after being granted the prison benefits in force at the time of his conviction. His release generated a wave of protests, especially in the Valencian community, where thousands of people demonstrated against someone like him being able to return to the streets. The victims' families expressed their outrage and pain at what they considered a mockery of their daughter's memory. Ricard was escorted by police upon leaving prison, and his subsequent whereabouts were kept secret for security reasons. Ricard's story after his release took an unexpected turn when in 2023, Portuguese media reported that he had been found dead in an apartment in Lisbon. According to available information, Ricard had been living in Portugal under a false identity, working in precarious jobs, and leading a discreet life away from the media spotlight. His death, apparently from natural causes, they closed one chapter of the case, but left open the most important one: the whereabouts of Antonio Angles. With Ricard dead, the only hope of obtaining more information about what really happened that November night in 1992 remained linked to the improbable capture of his accomplice. The legacy of the Alcàsser case is complex and contradictory. On one hand, it contributed to making Spanish society aware of the dangers that threaten the most vulnerable, the need to protect minors, the importance of taking precautions that were previously considered unnecessary. On the other hand, it fueled a culture of fear that sometimes borders on paranoia, a generalized distrust that hinders human relationships and can be as harmful as the dangers it seeks to prevent. The case also marked a before and after in the relationship between the media and violent crimes, establishing reporting patterns that remain in force today and continue to be the subject of ethical debates. True crime, that genre that mixes investigative journalism with entertainment based on real cases, has in Alcàsser one of its founding references in Spain. The documentaries, podcasts, books, and series that proliferate today about famous crimes owe much to the way that case was covered 3 decades ago. The narrative techniques, the emphasis on emotional details, the exploration of the psychological aspects of both victims and perpetrators, all of this has its roots in the media coverage of Alcàsser. For better or worse, that case established the model that countless subsequent productions about real crimes would follow. A whole generation of journalists and creators learned from this case how to tell stories about crimes in a way that attracts audiences, though also how to cross ethical boundaries in pursuit of sensation. Contemporary Spain still grapples with the questions that the Alcàsser case raised. How to balance the right to information with respect for victims and their families. How to prevent crime reporting from becoming exploitation of suffering. How to protect minors without falling into paralyzing paranoia. How to guarantee that the justice system offers penalties proportionate to the severity of crimes. These are questions that Spanish society is still searching for answers to, decades after 3 teenagers from a small Valencian town were torn from their lives by the most inhuman violence. But beyond sociological and media analyses, what remains at the heart of the Alcàsser case is a human tragedy of unfathomable dimensions. 3 girls who went out one Friday night to have fun and never came back. 3 families who lost what they loved most in the cruelest way imaginable. A community that was marked forever by a horror that no one saw coming. A country that discovered that evil has no borders, that it can lurk anywhere, that it doesn't respect innocence and doesn't forgive youth. The Alcàsser case is above all a story of irreparable loss, of truncated lives, of futures that will never exist. Miriam would already be over 40 years old. Perhaps she would have studied for a degree, formed a family, had children to whom she would tell stories of her childhood in the town. Perhaps she would have traveled the world, pursued her dreams, grown old, surrounded by the love of her family. Toni would have carried her contagious joy wherever she went, would have lit up rooms with her laughter, would have lived each day with the intensity that characterized her. Désirée would have continued dreaming, would perhaps have written the poems she kept in secret notebooks, would have found the true love she believed in, would have built a life worthy of her sensitivity. All of this was taken from them, and from those who loved them, by two individuals who chose the path of absolute evil. Time passes, but pain remains. The mothers and fathers of Miriam, Toni, and Désirée have aged carrying a weight that no one should carry, the weight of having survived their children, of having had to bury those who should have buried them. Some have died without seeing complete justice, without knowing what became of Antonio Anglès, without being able to close the darkest chapter of their lives. Those who still live do so with the certainty that this closure may never come, that they will have to settle for a partial justice that will never be enough. Their strength in the face of adversity, their ability to carry on despite everything, is a testimony to the resilience of the human spirit, but also a reminder of how unfair fate can be. In Alcàsser, life goes on, as in any other town in Spain. Children go to school, adults work, the elderly converse on the benches in the square. There are weddings and baptisms, patron saint festivals and football matches, everyday joys that make life worth living. But beneath the surface of that normality always beats the memory of what happened, a collective memory that is transmitted from generation to generation, a silent warning that evil exists and can arise when least expected. Today's children hear about Miriam, Toni, and Désirée as almost legendary figures, protagonists of a terrible story that their parents and grandparents lived through firsthand. For them, the case is history. For those who lived it, it is a wound that never stops bleeding. In the Alcàsser cemetery, 3 graves remember the victims. The headstones bear their names, their dates of birth and death, photographs of smiling girls who would never become women. The families come regularly to place flowers, to pray, to talk to those who can no longer answer. It is a ritual of pain and love that is repeated year after year, a way of keeping alive the bond with those who were taken too soon. The graves have also become a place of pilgrimage for people from all over Spain who want to pay tribute to the victims, who feel connected to their story, who want to express a solidarity that transcends time and distance. Every November, when the anniversary of the disappearance approaches, the town sinks into a silence laden with memory, and those who lost their loved ones relive the pain of those terrible days. Commemorative ceremonies are held, where neighbors and strangers alike gather to remember 3 girls who have become symbols of lost innocence, of interrupted youth, of the vulnerability that unites all parents in their deepest fears. The photographs of Miriam, Toni, and Désirée that were distributed during the search have become icons, images that represent not just 3 individual tragedies, but a collective wound that has never fully healed. The passing of time has diluted the intensity of memory for most Spaniards, but not for those who lived through the tragedy up close. In Alcàsser, the case remains a wound that won't heal. The town has grown, modernized, seen new neighbors arrive who didn't know Miriam, Tony, and Desiree, who only know of them from news reports and documentaries. But for those who were there, for those who knew them, for those who participated in the searches and wept at the funerals, the memory remains alive, as if it had happened yesterday. The elderly can point to specific corners and say, "This is where they used to wait for the bus. This is where they would buy sweets after school," transforming the urban landscape into a living memorial of 3 lives cut short. The mystery of Antonio Anglés remains unsolved. 30 years later, no one knows for certain whether he is alive or dead, whether he escaped or perished in the attempt. It is possible that we will never know, that the passage of time will eventually erase the few clues that might remain, that Anglés will become an eternal enigma, like so many other fugitives in history. But as long as there is the slightest possibility that he is alive, authorities will continue to search for him. Families will continue to wait, and Spanish society will continue to remember a case that marked its contemporary history indelibly. Periodically, leads emerge that seem promising. A facial recognition match in South America, a tip from someone who claims to have seen him in a remote village, a DNA sample that might belong to the fugitive. Each time, hopes are raised that the decades-long manhunt might finally end. Each time, the leads turn cold, the matches prove false, the witnesses unreliable. Anglés has become something of a bogeyman in Spanish culture, a figure invoked to warn children about the dangers of trusting strangers, a name that still sends chills down the spines of those old enough to remember the original case. His face, aged by computer algorithms to show what he might look like now, stares out from wanted posters that still hang in police stations across Spain and beyond. The case has spawned documentaries, books, podcasts, a true crime series, each one promising new revelations, each one adding another layer to a story that seems to have no end. Amateur sleuths pore over the evidence, convinced they can solve what professional investigators could not. Online forums debate the conspiracy theories, some rejecting them outright, others embracing them with fervor. The Alcàsser case has become part of Spain's cultural landscape, a reference point for discussions about crime, media, justice, and the protection of children. It is invoked whenever a similar tragedy occurs, a grim touchstone against which all other cases are measured. There are crimes that transcend their particular circumstances to become symbols of something larger. The Alcàsser case is one of them. It represents the loss of innocence of a society that believed itself safe, the awakening to a reality where horror can lurk around any corner, the transformation of the way we relate to our children and to strangers. It also represents the excesses of media that discovered the commercial potential of crime, the limitations of a justice system that cannot always offer the justice victims deserve, the conspiracy theories that flourish when official truth does not satisfy people's need for explanations. But above all, the Alcàsser case represents the suffering of 3 families who lost their daughters, the mourning of a community that lost 3 of its youngest members, the rage of a country that could not protect 3 of its most innocent citizens. It is a story of darkness and pain, but also of love and memory, of the determination not to forget, and of the will that those who died not be reduced to statistics or press headlines. Miriam, Tony, and Desiree were real people, with dreams and fears, with laughter and tears, with all the potential of lives that were just beginning. They deserve to be remembered for who they were, not just for how they died. On the night of November 13th, 1992, 3 friends left their homes to go to a party. It was a night like many others, any Friday in any town, in the Spain of those years. No one could imagine that that night would become the beginning of a nightmare that would mark an entire country, that the names of those 3 girls would remain forever etched in collective memory, that their tragedy would become a before and after in the history of crime in Spain. But so it was. And 30 years later, we continue to remember, we continue to wonder, while we continue to search for answers that may never come. Because there are stories that don't end, that remain suspended in a limbo of uncertainty and pain, that accompany us like ghosts of a past that refuses to rest. The November wind continues to blow over the fields of Valencia, over the streets of Alcàsser, over the graves of Miriam, Tony, and Desiree. It is the same wind that blew that terrible night, the same one that has blown every November since then, indifferent to the human pain it witnessed, foreign to the tragedy that unfolded under its cold breath. Years pass, generations succeed one another. The world changes at dizzying speed. But the memory of what happened remains, engraved in the stone of the headstones, in the memories of those who were there, and in the history of a country that learned in the cruelest way that innocence is a fragile good, that security is an illusion, that evil can lurk around any corner, waiting for its moment to destroy everything we love. Miriam Garcia Iborra, Antonia Gomez Rodriguez, Desiree Hernandez Folch. 3 names that Spain will not forget. 3 lives that deserve to be lived. 3 absences that weigh on all of us as a permanent reminder of our vulnerability, our mortality, the fragility of everything we take for granted. May they rest in peace, the girls of Alcàsser. May their memory be a blessing for those who love them, and a warning for those who have the duty to protect the innocent. May one day, hopefully, complete justice be done. And may we never, ever forget what happened to them, so that their suffering was not in vain, so that their story serves to prevent others from suffering the same fate, so that their memory makes us better as a society and as human beings. The Alcàsser case remains open. As long as Antonio Anglés is not found, alive or dead, as long as his final fate is not known, the chapter cannot close. The families continue to wait, investigators continue to search, society continues to remember. It is a wound that festers, a question without answer, an ending that doesn't arrive. Perhaps it must be so. Perhaps some crimes are condemned to remain partially unresolved, to become mysteries that defy our need for complete explanations. But as long as there is someone who remembers Miriam, Tony, Desiree, as long as there is someone who tells their story, as long as there is someone who demands justice in their name, they will not have died completely. They will live on in our memory, in our words, in our determination that such tragedies not be repeated. And that, perhaps, is the only possible form of victory against the darkness that engulfed them that November night in 1992.